we're sort of at the mercy of what we're able to get from those government agencies. And so our job is to determine what requests there are to be made, that is, figure out where the holes are in the record, pore through the secondary source research, put together a chronology, understand where the state of access is, and then start looking for the things that we don't have. So to do that, we will file, hundreds and thousands of Freedom of Information Act requests every year. And there's, an importance in sort of sending a high volume of requests and then following up with those. So there's an appeal process where you can challenge the government's decisions if you don't like, that they've denied information to you. So, we spend a lot of time writing the requests. We supplement that with research in the U.S. National Archives. And we also have programs, many of our programs, where we file Freedom of Information requests in other countries. Mexico is a key example of that, where we're focused on trying to bring to light some of the sort of more egregious documents on some of the more egregious human rights violations that have happened there, using a portion of Mexico's access law that requires them to release information on grave violations of human rights abuses, which is a sort of advantage that they have in Mexico over the United States. Well, it's very mixed, but it's really simple to file a FOIA request. Used to be that we'd send them via fax or even, sort of a old school letter in an envelope. Normally now it's done online. And you send it directly to the relevant agency. So for us, it's the Department of State or the Department of Defense or the CIA, mainly, organizations that are involved with the making of foreign policy, not so much domestic policy, although there are reasons to do that too. Many times we'll send the request to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice has many sub-agencies that we also send requests to. The DEA, for example, is very involved in Mexico and Colombia, have personnel there writing their own intelligence reports all the time. So we're also looking at that kind of stuff. But, the main thing to know about FOIA is that it can be very useful. It can also be very discouraging. I think a lot of journalists will use the FOIA. They'll try with one or two requests, and they don't get anything, or they don't follow up, or the requests don't come back in time for them to be useful. A journalist is working on a deadline. So, and I think the FOIA, is thought of kind of as a tool for those sorts of researchers, people who are trying to break news or shed light on policy, and it's hard unless you have the time to wait around. So, even for a college student or somebody working on a dissertation, well, they maybe have a little more time, but they're going to still need to file those requests pretty early if they want to be able to first get the initial response, which might take a year or two, could take even more. There are requests that languish in the system for 10, 20 years if people don't press the government to get on them. And then to appeal those responses. And of course, if your appeal doesn't work out, then what you can do is go to court. But, we're a relatively small organization. We don't have the resources to go to court to litigate every one of these requests. So we compensate for that by, doing a high volume of requests, making the same kinds of requests to multiple agencies that, sort of have a different view on whatever the issue might be, and try to get at the answer that way. There's also a lot of opportunities, it's difficult to get documents from intelligence agencies. The CIA, the National Security Agency, they tend to be fairly opaque when it comes to these issues. However, there's a lot of times when you can find those documents within the sort of the coffers of other agencies. So the Department of State will respond to a request by saying, here are the State Department records that we have. We can give you these. We won't give you these. These documents we're going to excise the sensitive portions. So a lot of times we get documents that have blacked out parts, deleted parts. But they may have documents from the CIA and their holdings as well, because the agencies share records. So they would then send those records over to those agencies for a direct response. But in some ways, it can speed up the requests if one agency finds another agency's documents. But the key is that the burden is on the government to explain to the requester why they can't release any particular document or portion of a document. And there are 9 exemptions under the FOIA that they would have to cite. They would have to cite one of the 9 exemptions in order to deny the information. And that gives you a basis then to appeal. So if they say this is because of could do grave harm to national security, that's one thing. And they might say this relates solely to the internal rules and practices of the agency. And that's another manner for them to deny, sort of serial numbers and sort of internal codes and sort of their own, internal tracking systems and that sort of thing, you might get those denied, which we don't care so much about. Then, an ongoing investigation from a law enforcement agency would also be denied. Documents related to an investigation that's in the courts or that's still being looked at. Another fairly controversial one is documents relating to the deliberative process, which is also sometimes read fairly broadly by the agencies. And, in a certain sense, you could deny almost anything as part of a deliberation process that's not a final policy decision, because any final policy decision can then lead into another deliberative process. So that's one that we fight against quite a bit. And we have a sort of an advocacy side too. So we do research and we collect these documents. We publish them in various ways. But we also advocate for better transparency laws, stronger laws in the United States and also in other countries. In some cases, groups will come to us. We get approached by groups in Mexico or Colombia or Guatemala, other parts of, well, not just Latin America, but all over the world. But in terms of transitional justice, many of those things have been playing out in Latin America. We have a lot of experience there. So we've sort of, over time, we've been around for several decades. So we've sort of built up a reputation, and people know that they can come to us and that we'll support these sorts of processes. We've been involved in transitional justice processes since as far back as the early 1990s with the Truth Commission in El Salvador. We've been involved in multiple Truth Commissions in Latin America and Guatemala, some other processes of more limited scope in different countries, in Peru, in Ecuador. And we've always been there and ready to play a role and to sort of donate what we have in our collections, because in many cases in Colombia or Mexico or Guatemala was a very prime example of a country where there was almost no information available about the security forces, the military, the police, which were responsible for the vast majority of the abuses during that war, and it was judged to be a genocide. So there was very little available in that country. So we were able to take thousands of documents, including biographic material about generals and other people in the military, to create a database of the key officers and key units of the military, sort of biographic sketches, if you will, drawn from a multitude of documents that we figured out a way to sort of compile it all into a database, and then we're able to present it in Guatemala City as sort of a contribution to that effort at transitional justice process. But at a different level, even if we're not creating databases, we still make an effort to sort of bring these collections to bear for truth commissions. And then truth commissions often are sort of limited in what they can do. Maybe they're not set up to be punitive, but down the road we've seen in many cases amnesty laws later lifted, judicial processes, historical cases of historical justice coming to the fore 20, 30 years later. And by then, we have more documents, more detailed documents, even a clearer picture of what's going on. And then we can sort of feed those documents back into judicial processes, either through, victims, attorneys, who are involved in the legal processes, or, through direct communications with prosecutors and judges, sort of depending on the legal system in those countries. So to answer your question, sometimes we reach out because we know we have something, we know it would be of use, we know that this tribunal is happening, or that this, there's some investigation happening in another country, and we just keep on top of those things. But more often than not, I'd say people come to us. And what we've been able to do in many cases that's been very helpful, I think, is to help lobby the U.S. government and to sort of use what influence we might have to persuade the U.S. government to make a special declassification project, one that expedites the declassification of key documents that the truth commissions and that some of these judicial processes will need to do their work. So that was very successful in El Salvador, also in Guatemala. For Chile, there was recently a special declassification done for Argentina. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the organizing principle of the archive when we started in the 80s, before my time, but when they started in the 80s was really to explore U.S. policy. And if you look at what the initial projects were, there was one on the Iran Revolution, there was one on Nicaragua, one about El Salvador, and it was really kind of looking at some of these hotspots where the U.S. was intervening in the world, or where the U.S. had a key role somewhere in the history, like, in Iran with the 1953 coup. So we've actually focused on many of those flashpoints of either the Cold War or the post-Cold War, where the U.S. has played a role that was negative, or many perceive to be negative. We've done a lot of work on the Vietnam War. We've done a lot of work on the more recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had a set of documents just on what they called Iraq Gate, which was the sort of tilt towards Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So that was kind of the key organizing principle at the beginning. There wasn't a concerted effort at that time to sort of get involved in any legal processes, more to just bring things to light. And then if people wanted to do things with that, they could do it. And then, our entree, if you will, into transitional justice really came through these truth commissions. And that was how it became sort of a thing where we were really more addressing injustices in other countries, but using this collection that we have. I'll say that, when we're working to try to sort of shed light on things in the U.S. or reform the U.S., a lot of that's geared towards improving transparency, fighting excessive secrecy. We've done a lot, certain members of my organization testify before Congress quite often about those issues, about reform of the FOIA. There are some examples, at least in my own project. Last year, I was at the ICC to deliver the International Criminal Court to deliver a packet of documents that we were able to get from the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission about the crimes of the U.S.-based corporation Chiquita Brands International in Colombia, where they were paying money for years and years to both the left-wing guerrilla groups and the right-wing paramilitary groups. And we found evidence that they had been getting something in return for that, and it wasn't purely extortion. And there's an effort now to bring some of these corporate executives to justice in the International Criminal Court. So it plays out that way. We have another project called the Torture Archive, which is specifically geared just towards documenting the use of torture by U.S. forces and the CIA during the recent last, I guess, almost 20 years at this point. So it's things like that. But there's been, the fact is in the United States, we haven't had a truth commission. We haven't had a lot of these, historical justice things come to the fore. The instant they do, we'll be there. Work to get, if there's not a FOIA law in your country, work really hard to get some kind of access to information legislation on the books. Make sure it's good. You can learn. We have all kinds of advice to give about that and about what works in the United States, what doesn't work, and what's worked in Mexico, Guatemala, other countries. So I think there's a lot we can teach people about that. I also think you can learn a lot just from our collections. If someone is trying in Colombia, for example, to there's a very serious transitional justice process, beginning now in Colombia with a truth commission and a war crimes court. And what they're going to need more than anything are Colombian documents from the Colombian intelligence archives, from the military, from the internal security forces. And if they can, documents from the illegal armed groups, the FARC, or the paramilitaries. The point is that they may not even know where to begin looking. And I think they could learn a lot by looking through our collections, understanding, these are records of, how the U.S. interacted with their counterparts in Mexico, records of meetings that happened, relationships that existed, the kinds of security assistance that was flowing to those organizations. That can be a kind of a roadmap for when they get around to looking through their own archives, trying to figure out what should be there, where it might be, in whose files it might exist. But more than anything, I think, we have been very persistent. We are, getting to be sort of an old organization now, and there's a real value to being there and waiting for the results of these things. It would be much better world if these processes moved faster, if there was a better guarantee in the United States, at least, of sort of a timely response. But lacking that, I think that having an organization that exists and that will still exist and will exist beyond the particular people who are doing the research to be there when those records come in, I think that's something that's very important and something that I've learned a lot about the archive. And and that's one of the reasons why there's very little staff turnover at the archive. We have a lot of very dedicated people. I've been there for 20 years, and I'm not even nearly the most senior person. So it's there's a real value in that kind of persistence, I think.